Hey everyone, welcome to our presentation about Darwin's ideas. Now, this is a picture of Charles Darwin when he was much older, and you might know by this point in time that Darwin was one of the main scientists involved in the development of what we now know as the theory of evolution. Now, he didn't necessarily know too much about evolution, but he published a book that was one of the main inspirations for what we've developed for the theory, and his book was called On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. What he means by races is species. So this is Charles Darwin's findings. It's a collection of what he knew and learned based on his experiences in the Galapagos Islands and around the world. But let's talk a little bit more about what his ideas were and where they came from. Before we start really getting into natural selection, let's talk about something a bit familiar: adaptations. You might know adaptations are traits that nature has chosen for different organisms to have based on how it helps those organisms survive or reproduce. Organisms always want to not only survive for a long period of time, but also reproduce and make new organisms for the next generation. Now, certain traits are going to help them do that. So, for example, you can see in this top corner is a moth, and that moth is showing the trait of camouflage. You can barely see it, but it is a moth against tree bark. It's camouflaged. Here is mimicry. Those are some snakes, and one of them is venomous, the eastern coral snake, and one of them is not, the king snake. But because the king snake looks like the coral snake, it's not going to get eaten because organisms might think other organisms might think that it's dangerous or venomous. There are also a adaptation among bacteria, which is antibiotic resistance. As bacteria have changed and gotten used to our antibiotics that we've produced as humans, they have needed to become antibiotic resistant, and that is an adaptation or trait that can help those bacteria survive even if we take an antibiotic medicine. It's important to note that adaptations can happen over a long period of time or a short period of time. That's different from evolution. Evolution is something that we say is change that occurs over a long period of time. All right, so let's find out more about this natural selection idea. There's four principles of natural selection: variation, inheritance, competition, and natural selection through reproduction. So let's see how that works in the sunflower population. Now, variation basically just means that not all of the sunflowers there look the same, right? I think you could agree some are taller and some are shorter. There is variation, there are many different ones. And what we know about how traits get passed on from one generation to the next is that they are inherited. So the taller sunflowers will tend to produce other sunflowers that are also tall, and the short sunflowers will tend to produce sunflowers that are also short. So there was variation, and those traits, like being tall or being short, are going to get passed down to the next generation. Now, not only is there variation in the fact that traits get passed down, but there's also competition. In this field, there are not enough nutrients and supplies, and so there's competition. Certain sunflowers are going to survive and others will not. And in this particular field, the tall sunflowers will not survive and the short ones will survive. So due to competition, we find out that the shorter sunflowers are more likely to survive. Later, that leads to what we call natural selection. Over time, the average height of the entire population of sunflowers is short because when there was originally variation, there were many different sizes of sunflowers, and those traits got passed down. And we found out that in that field, there weren't enough nutrients. So only the short ones would survive. Over a long, 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 long time, many generations, there was natural selection and it favored short sunflowers. So short sunflowers tended to reproduce more successfully and survive longer. And so now the overall population has changed. So we used to have a lot of different sunflowers in this population, but because of the way that there's inheritance and competition, now the sunflowers in that field are pretty much all short. That's because the trait of being short was naturally selected over the trait of being tall. Let's break this down even a little bit further and look at another example. So, how does this really happen? It takes three things. There's got to be a struggle to exist, kind of like here, there were not enough nutrients for all of the sunflowers to survive. there's going to be survival of the fittest. Here, only the short ones survived. And descent with modification means that over time, only the short ones continue to survive and reproduce. And so now the sunflower has changed and it has become a shorter species. But how does this happen in a mouse population, for example? In this original population, there is a struggle to exist. That hawk is going to try to eat mice, right? So not all of the mice are going to survive. And there are some that are more fit or more ready to survive than others. So in this picture, you can see the gray mice blended in with their surroundings, and the tan mice, they didn't. And so guess what the hawk ate? The hawk ate the tan mice. So this mouse, this mouse, this mouse, and this mouse got eaten. They did not survive. The fittest survived, meaning the gray rats tended to survive more likely than the tan rats. And then over many generations, you would see a higher rate of gray mice than tan mice because the gray mice were the fittest ones. They were the ones who were able to survive and reproduce, and the tan ones were not. And so, over a long period of time, we would call that descent with modification because these mice are descendants of this original population of mice, but they are modified to be more likely to be gray because of the struggle to exist. Let's break these things down a little bit more. The struggle to exist. Members of each species must compete. They must compete with each other. They must compete with other species to get food, living space, mates, etc. Who's going to stay alive? Well, the ones who are most fit, the ones who are, if they're prey, are faster to get away from their predators, the ones that have better camouflage, the ones that have better defenses, or if they're a predator, the ones who are faster. So in this picture, the bears are fighting, they're struggling to get salmon, and only the best bear is probably going to get salmon. Here, the lioness is trying to find a meal, and only the fittest porcupines are going to survive, the ones that are going to intimidate her and make her not want to eat the porcupine. So that's a struggle for existence. There's a lot of different pressures, and species must compete and deal with those pressures in order to stay alive and eventually reproduce. Only the fittest will survive. So that basically means that individuals who are better suited for their environment are going to not only survive, but also reproduce more successfully. So, for example, in this bird might have been considered the fittest because there's competition to reproduce, and only the birds with the nice red chest feathers would reproduce. So, this bird was the fittest. And in fact, it did survive and reproduce. And guess what? These offspring are probably going to have very red, nice chests because of what trait was passed on to them. The reason that trait was passed on, because that was the best trait for survival and reproduction. So that's survival of the fittest. Descent with modification basically means that each species has changed over time from other species. So if we're looking back at this mouse example, originally this species contained both gray and tan mice about equally, even possibly more tan mice. But over a long period of time, through descent with modification, the gray mice became more prevalent in this species, and the species kind of changed as a whole to reflect that the gray mice were more able to survive. So, descent with modification, each species has descended with changes from other species over time. They didn't just pop out of nowhere. Common descent is a little bit more unique idea. It's taking it a step further. Common descent is this idea that actually all species that are either currently living or extinct may have possibly come from one common ancestor or a couple of just small common ancestors. And that means that there's basically one tree of life. And you can see that idea here, kind of saying that maybe one original species ended up branching off into bacteria and archaea, and then the eukaryotic organisms like plants, animals, fungi, and protists. So that's the idea of common descent. It takes Darwin's ideas a step further. That was not one of Darwin's ideas, but it is a modern scientific thought that maybe all living things came from one original living organism. Um, Thank you so much for listening.